maybe before I start, just by way of context, I very much wanted to share some new work with you, which means that this is very new. This is the first time I've tried to put an argument about these things together, which means that I'm sure some things will have to be changed. At the very least, my punchline is not is probably not the best, but I find the issues that I'm talking about to be very interesting. So I hope that you will also find it very interesting. And I look forward to hearing what you have to think about it. So I entitled the talk Knowledge in Real World Contexts because I'm going to be talking about basically how we can fit together a very knowledge-centric approach to epistemology with a variety of very interesting, very new stories about how things work in particular epistemic contexts where knowledge doesn't seem to play a role. And basically, I want to try to reconcile the knowledge-centric framework with these stories, which I find interesting and worthwhile. So I'm going to start by motivating the knowledge-centric approach to epistemology. So I'll explain why many people in recent decades have decided that knowledge needs to be put back in the center in epistemology and why it should be paid much more attention to, why it should figure more prominently in stories that we tell about humans' epistemic activities. And then I'm going to juxtapose this knowledge-centric approach with three stories from very recent epistemology, which, as I said, I find very interesting, but very appealing. But in all of these stories, knowledge doesn't seem to play the role that you would expect it to play if we think kind of antecedently that knowledge should be in the middle of stories that we are telling in epistemology. And one story will be regarding science, what pronouncements scientists should be making. The second story is about politics, specifically what the norms are which govern, say, what kind of input we should be taking from scientists when we have to make decisions in, say, a political context. And the third story has to do with reasoning, which could be in a scientific or a political context or just in an everyday context. And after explaining why knowledge should be central and why it looks like in many cases it isn't, then I'm going to try to reconcile the first two parts of the talk by arguing for how knowledge should be put back into the stories that we're telling. And the story will be here slightly different for the different accounts that I've described in the second part of the talk. But nonetheless, I'll draw some general conclusions from everything that I've said before. Okay. So I'll begin by motivating this knowledge-centric approach to epistemology, which for those of you who pay a lot of attention to epistemology, this will be kind of old news, but if you don't pay that much attention, then maybe this is new and exciting to you. So by way of motivating this, I'll start with a quote by Michael Hanan, which appears at the beginning of his book, What's the Point of Knowledge? And Hanan writes, "The word know is remarkable for a number of reasons. It is one of the 10 most commonly used verbs in English. It seems to find a comfortable meaning equivalent in every human language. It is one of a very small number of words that are allegedly culturally universal. This all suggests that knowledge is deeply important to human life." And what we get out from this quote is not just the fact that knowledge seems to be very special and very important to humans, but also in the background is the fact that we can't say any of these things about the word belief, which for a very long time in epistemology was basically taken to be central. Very long projects trying to explain what makes it justified to have a particular belief, what kinds of beliefs we should have. If you're more familiar with the whole formal epistemology literature, most of that is centered around these probabilistic credences, which are a species of belief. But the observation here is that the word belief does not seem to be so kind of central to ordinary human life. It doesn't have kind of easy equivalents in other human languages or in other cultures. It seems, in fact, to be kind of a special term that epistemologists have made up and focused on. But the idea here is that, well, there are good reasons for paying more attention to knowledge because it seems to be more central to our lives, actually, more kind of a natural concept and arguably then also more important to us. And based on this this kind of general motivation, there have been a few research programs developed which try to kind of develop alternative ways to do epistemology or to tell new stories in epistemology, which kind of put knowledge into the central place that it seems it deserves to occupy. And the first of these research programs, which we can aptly describe as basically arguing for a paradigm shift in epistemology, is what's known as knowledge-first epistemology. And this was initiated by Timothy Williamson. It's been followed up on by many people. Of course, there are people who argue against it, but for my purposes today, I just want to kind of show you why this is an intuitive way to approach epistemology. And there are, for our purposes, then two kind of key pieces of the knowledge-first approach to epistemology. The first one is that knowledge is taken as a primitive concept. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, there was this long program in epistemology trying to analyze knowledge into a set of necessary and sufficient conditions, trying to solve the Gettier problem. And most think that this project just has not been successful. And Williamson argues that this is because knowledge, in fact, cannot be analyzed into a set of necessary and sufficient components. And he argues that we should basically just stop trying, and then the problem disappears. And we should just accept that knowledge is a primitive concept, that we are able to identify knowledge out in the world. He says, a basic distinction between knowledge and ignorance, and we can just work with this, and then use that as our starting place to make sense of the other important concepts in epistemology. The second piece of this research program then is that in line with taking knowledge as a primitive, which helps us to understand everything else, knowledge is taken to set the normative standard of basically everything else that we're interested in. So knowledge sets the normative standard for belief on this picture. It's kind of right for you to believe something just in case your belief counts as knowledge, or beliefs aim at knowledge is another way of putting this. And most importantly, for our purposes today, knowledge also sets the normative standard for assertions and for actions. So you should assert something only if you know that thing, and you should act only on your knowledge base. And so this gives us a nice kind of simple, coherent normative picture. And it also importantly helps us to make sense of just a lot of the way that we behave in everyday life and our ordinary language use. And this is illustrated by some made up but very natural sample quotes. So we can easily imagine someone saying something like, "Hey, you shouldn't have told me that the border was open. You didn't know that at the time." So maybe somebody wanted to travel between, say, northern Germany and Denmark, and their friend says, "Oh yeah, go ahead, have a great time, the border's open." And if the person who is traveling finds out later that their friend didn't actually know that the border was open, then we will not be surprised if they get upset and then challenge their friend and say, "Hey, you shouldn't have told me something that you didn't know was the case." Even if it happens to be true that the border was open, if the person who asserts this didn't know, then we feel that they can be judged negatively in this context. And we see a similar kind of thing when we are talking about actions. So in a similar spirit, we can easily imagine, perhaps some of us have even heard such a thing uttered, we can imagine someone saying something like, "Hey, you shouldn't have gone to visit grandma since you didn't know your snuffles weren't COVID." So the idea here is that you should act, you should do something, for example, going to visit your grandmother, only on the basis of your knowledge. And in current times, this means that you should know that you merely have a cold and you do not have COVID, right? So it's not enough to have a belief that you don't have COVID. It's not even enough for it to be true that you don't have COVID. You should really know that's the case before you take action on that assumption, right? And so this, yeah, of course, there are lots of debates around exactly how this picture functions, but at least the basic motivation and intuition should be clear, and I hope that this looks like an intuitive and appealing picture to you. Okay. Another line of research in recent epistemology, which I would describe as very much knowledge-centric, is the project started by Craig and followed up by Hanan, whose work I focus on for the purposes of today. And this line of research tries to identify the point of knowledge. So the quote that I started with, Hanan is explaining that, okay, the concept of knowledge seems to be extremely important to people, and this raises the question, okay, what is this doing for us? Why is it so important that we be able to label knowers in the world, that we are using this verb more often than most of the other verbs that we use, for example? And so Hanan gives us an answer to what the point of knowledge is. And this starts with the observation that humans are part of epistemic communities and highly dependent on others. And those who are aware of social epistemology will know that this observation has become extremely important in recent years. And we've realized that it's problematic to do epistemology and kind of neglect the fact that we are embedded in communities. Most of what we know, most of the information that we get, we're getting from other people. We can't verify it by ourselves. So it's extremely important that we, for example, have mechanisms to know what information to trust, what information to distrust, and so forth. Then Hanan goes on to argue that the concept of knowledge is used basically for us to pick out reliable informants. So we need to know who the reliable informants are. And if we call someone a knower, that's basically how we put the stamp on them that says, okay, this person is a reliable informant on that topic. If I need information about this, then that's who I want to ask. And again, this seems to fit very well with how our epistemic lives actually work. It fits very well with how we use language, because we can easily imagine similarly that, okay, now we have a new war, and maybe many of us feel that we're in a poor epistemic position to really thoroughly understand what's going on and why and what might happen. And so this is a context in which we, of course, we want reliable informants. If we want to understand better, we need to say, okay, who can really tell us something, instead of just kind of speculating and repeating things they might have seen on the internet. And saying that someone knows is how we basically indicate who the worthwhile people to talk to about this are. So you can easily imagine some colleagues talking about this, and they might say, hey, let's go ask our colleague Irina about the Russian perspective on the war, because obviously she knows a lot more than we do. So if we want to understand better, that's where we want to go get our information from. And again, there are various debates about exactly how this works, how it fits with the Knowledge First program, and so forth. Those aren't so important. What's important is that you should see that there's a very strong motivation for thinking that basically knowledge should be very central to our investigations of humans' epistemic activities and how our epistemic communities are functioning. And because of this, many epistemologists in recent decades have argued that we should change how we do epistemology, and that knowledge should really be in the center. Okay. Okay, so the upshot then, to reiterate, is that knowledge seems to be really fundamental in our lives. It's critical that we can identify out there in the world, that we can share it effectively, that we can act on it. And therefore, it should also be central to the explanations that we give of people's epistemic activities and of our judgments of people's epistemic activities. Okay. And so basically, this is the perspective that I'm coming from. But then what I noticed reading around in other corners of epistemology is that this idea that knowledge should occupy a central place doesn't seem to be reflected in what's going on elsewhere in epistemology. And many times what's going on elsewhere seems not to fit very well with the idea that knowledge should be in the center, which for me raises the question, okay, why, what's going on? Is there something wrong in one side or the other? And so that's kind of the problem that I'm trying to address today. So I'm going to look at three basically contrary stories from elsewhere in epistemology broadly construed that again seem not to fit very well with this kind of knowledge-centric perspective that I motivated. And the first of these alternative arguments that I want to look at is basically presented in an article by Deng and your very own Liam Bright. And they make an argument about scientific pronouncements. And they summarize their key claim and their argument as follows. They say, we argue that the main results of scientific papers may appropriately be published, even if they are false, unjustified, and not believed to be true or justified by their author. So what's the idea? Why do they argue that scientists' main claim don't need to be true, justified, or believed? Well, the idea behind this, the argument relies on the idea that science can only make progress actually if we put non-known conclusions out there. So if scientists are very conservative, if they're very careful, and they won't assert some kind of conclusion unless they meet some kind of very high standard, then they won't be putting enough out there at all, and progress will be very slow. And this is closely connected to the very important idea that there's in fact a division of labor within the scientific community. And based on this kind of division of labor, science makes progress by some scientists pursuing ideas which turn out to be wrong, but that means other scientists can pursue ideas which turn out to be right. So we don't know in advance which ideas, which theories, which methods are going to be the ones that really move us forward, that turn out to be correct. And so basically we need to cover the space of possibilities well, but this means that some scientists need to be working on things which are not going to turn out to be fruitful, which maybe even from our present perspective, we think look a bit crazy, right? And if the scientists themselves can sometimes recognize this, then it makes sense that kind of in the service of progress, scientists might be putting forth conclusions that they themselves don't even believe, right? So this is the idea. But of course, this apparently contradicts the knowledge norm of assertion. So if we think that it's appropriate to assert things only if you know those things on the one hand, and on the other hand, we say, well, okay, but scientists can be putting conclusions out there which they don't even believe, which aren't true, which aren't justified. It looks like these things don't fit very well together. And I should say, Dang and Bright, I think they don't argue that when a scientist puts forward a main claim that this is an assertion. I'm also going to leave this open, but I'm just going to observe that on the face of it, these two ideas don't look like they fit together very well. And so it raises the question, okay, what's going on? How do we kind of get rid of this apparent either contradiction or at least kind of uncomfortable state of affairs? Okay, so I'm going to set this account to the side to look at two further accounts where there's a similar kind of mismatch or question raised. The first one has to do with political legitimacy. And so here I'm looking at a piece of the work by Fabian Peter, and I'm looking specifically at an argument that she makes in the context of a larger project where she's looking at political legitimacy, and she's looking at how basically what makes political deliberation well-ordered or legitimate. And one specific question that we're interested in there is, okay, what is the normative standard for the inputs to a political deliberation process? And very importantly, when we have political deliberation, we need to decide what to do about some important issue, say a new pandemic or a climate change problem. Then we need input from scientists, of course. And there's a question, okay, what is the standard that the input that we get from scientists needs to meet? If you're coming from a kind of knowledge-focused perspective, then you might say, well, okay, the knowledge norm is a natural candidate. The scientists should give as input, and the group should use in their deliberation to decide what to do, only say propositions which are going to count as knowledge. And Fabian Peter considers this as a possible epistemic norm for this context, but she rejects it. So she explicitly argues against it. And her reasoning, she summarizes as follows. She writes, there are too many uncertainties in the political context to allow for a meaningful restriction of well-ordered political deliberation to what is known. Even the best scientific advice, the kind of advice we would want political decisions to be based on, tends not to consist of what is known, but reflects a temporary broad consensus among scientists about what is justifiably believed in this regard. So The idea basically is that, well, okay, in political discourse, for example, we're trying to decide what to do about climate change, say, it's necessary to defer to experts in political discourse so they have information which we need and which we certainly should use. But she argues that even experts face a lot of uncertainty. For example, in the case of climate change, a lot of what scientists are using to figure out the problem, what might happen, are models. There's a lot of uncertainty involved in models. They're very abstract. They don't tell you, okay, this is exactly what's going to happen. They show you ranges of possibilities and so forth. And so Peter argues, okay, that the knowledge norm is too high of standard, but of course, this directly contradicts the knowledge norm. And so again, it looks like there's very clearly a mismatch, raises the question, what do we do? What do we say about this? The third story, which will have a similar kind of feature, is the argumentative theory of reasoning. So here I'm focusing on Mercier and Sperber's work, and in particular, their presentation of their theory of reasoning in their 2017 book, The Enigma of Reason. And what they argue in this book is that reason is not a flawed superpower, even though it may look, according to the kind of traditional approach to reasoning, like a flawed superpower. So it looks like a superpower, and that reasoning is obviously, it seems to be the thing that allows humans to do science, for example, to make all kinds of inventions, figure out all kinds of things about the world that other species apparently can't do. But reason also looks flawed in that it's beset with all manner of biases. We are prone to all kinds of fallacies in our reasoning. And so reasoning, according to the kind of traditional approach, again, looks like a flawed superpower. And they argue that it doesn't make a lot of sense to think that basically evolution endowed us with a flawed superpower. They argue rather it makes more sense to try to figure out kind of what reason is supposed to be doing for us to understand kind of why it looks the way it looks. And so they provide an answer, well, they provide an explanation of what reason is and what it's supposed to be doing for us, so that basically what looked like bugs turn out to be features, and basically how reason works makes sense in light of their new story about how it's supposed to work and what it is supposed to do for us. And their answer, they express as follows. They say, we produce reasons in order to justify our thoughts and actions to others, and to produce arguments to convince others to think and act as we suggest. So the key here is that reason evolved to be used in a social context. And this means it's going to break, it's going to not function properly if it's used in a different kind of context. But when used in a social context, we should expect it to, in general, surface pretty well. And this means, for example, that the bias that they refer to as my side bias, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, basically this this feature of humans where we're very, very good at justifying, coming up for more and more reasons to keep believing things that we already believe. We're very good at justifying the things that we've already done. We're not so good at criticizing our existing beliefs. We are very good at criticizing things other people believe that we don't also believe, and so forth. They argue that this my side bias looks like a bug, it looks like a flaw if we're thinking of reasoning as just kind of meant to lead the solitary individual to truth. But if we think of reason as something evolved to be in a social context, then it makes sense that we would have a kind of my side bias, because in a social context, this kind of bias can actually produce an efficient division of labor when we reason together. So a similar kind of idea as is underlying Liam's argument, actually, where if we are trying to come to a good judgment about what to believe or what to do about climate change, say, as a group, then it might work out really well, actually, if I'm kind of initially inclined to one course of action and you're initially inclined to another course of action, and we both just, as our jobs, we take our jobs to be listing out the best reasons we can for the course of action that we prefer. And then at the end, we'll have a list of reasons which kind of covers both sides, and we can put these all together and then come to an overall judgment as to what we should do about the problem. And what's interesting here, coming from a very knowledge-centric perspective, is that Mercier and Sperber write quite a long and very, very thorough book where they cover a lot of topics, and knowledge is really barely mentioned. So the word comes up a handful of times, but not in any kind of deeper, interesting way. And so it looks again like we have a mismatch. And in particular, we can identify two mismatches between the knowledge-centric approach to epistemology and the argumentative theory of reasoning. So first of all, according to Mercier and Sperber's theory, people are, when they provide reasons, so we reason in a social context, and our job is just kind of to support our own side, which means that when we reason, so when I tell you something and then you tell me something, I'm providing reasons really just to serve my own interests, right? So I have some preferred course of action regarding climate change, and when we reason about what we should do about it as a society, I'm just going to list reasons that kind of fit with the things that I would like to see us do anyhow. And in doing this, I'm very lax in giving reasons. So my standard for putting something forward as a reason is very, very low. I don't criticize my reasons. I just kind of check which ones fit my own interests, which support my own preferred course of action. But this looks like it fits, again, very, very poorly with the knowledge norm of assertion, because on the one hand, the knowledge norm of assertion would suggest that we have a very high standard for what's required to assert something, namely, I have to know that it's true. And the impression that you get from reading about the argumentative theory of reasoning is that the standard for assertion in an argument is actually very, very low, because kind of if we end up coming to a good conclusion, it's because of the way all of our kind of low standard bearing reasons put together will allow us to reach something better, right? So it's someone else's job to criticize the reasons that I put forward. So again, it looks like we have a mismatch between knowledge norm, very high standard, argumentative theory of reasoning, super low standard for giving something as a reason. There's another way where the argumentative theory seems to fit poorly with the knowledge-centric account, and this is in that there isn't the kind of connection you might expect between the argumentative theory of reasoning and Hanan's story about knowledge being extremely important because we need to, well, the concept being important because we need to identify the reliable informants in our community. Because the other part of their story about how argumentation or reasoning works is that, okay, on the one hand, I'm very lax when I want to put something on the table as a reason, but people are also very vigilant in accepting reasons. So when we're engaged in some kind of argument, I want us to do the thing that I would like to do in the end. And so I just put whatever reasons on the table support this, but I also want information from you. So I want to take reasons from you. I want us to engage in reasoning. And if you have good reasons, if you have useful information, then I also want the benefits of information. So for example, if you know a lot about climate change or society, then I would like to kind of hear what you have to say, and I would like this to be integrated into the final decision that we make. But I don't want to be manipulated. And this means that when you put a reason on the table, I don't just accept it and say, oh yeah, maybe this is a good reason for doing the thing you want to do. I think very carefully about whether the reason you put on the table is a good reason. And then this raises the question, well, okay, according to Hanan, he basically gives a different solution to this problem. So Hanan also says, yeah, we want good information without being taken advantage of, that's less important to his story. And for him, the solution is that we as a community kind of label certain people as knowers about certain topics, and then that's just where we get the information from. Whereas for Mercier and Sperber, there isn't this kind of, at least it doesn't appear in the story that they tell, there isn't this kind of labeling as people and we listen to certain people. Rather, again, it's like everyone just kind of throws out nonsense that fits their purposes. And we as the receivers are just very careful about vetting that information. And somehow through the argumentative process, we're meant to come to a good conclusion via a social process rather than kind of deferring to knowers or something like this. Right. And so again, this seems to be a mismatch because according to Hanan, the point of knowledge is solving this problem of who to listen to, and Mercier and Sperber give a very detailed, extremely interesting, but seemingly very different story about kind of how information is taken up and integrated and transformed into decisions. Okay, so I hope that wasn't too much. That was quite a lot of existing literature that I'm going to try to bring together. But as promised, now I want to try to show that these kind of seemingly contradictory stories need not be so contradictory, or at least that we can tell nice stories about how everything actually fits together in a way that makes sense. And I'll go one by one through the three accounts that I already introduced you to. So I'll start with Dang and Bright's argument about scientific pronouncements. So they make, of course, it's an important point that we don't want scientists to be too conservative, to put too little out there for the community, because then we won't make progress. But this raises a big question. So if the standards for assertion in the scientific community are really very, very low, because we're afraid of setting them too high, then this raises a concern that, well, there's going to be actually too much junk put out there. So if the standards for assertion don't involve truth or justification or belief, it looks really like a very low standard. And then it might look like we're going to have kind of the opposite problem of what we were worried about, that scientists are putting forth, just kind of so much junk that many scientists are going to be building upon things which are junk, which aren't very promising, aren't going to work out. And as a community, then it's a question, okay, how are we going to find the treasure? How are we going to find the good conclusions so that we can make progress? And I think I can answer this question. So the key idea is that, well, Dang and Bright in their paper focus on what they call main conclusions. So I think in principle, their argument applies to, say, the thing you put in the title of the paper and what you put maybe in your introduction and in your conclusion. When you're trying to explain the significance of your paper, you're trying to kind of make an indication of who should read it and what the upshot is. When you're trying to sell and advertise the paper and kind of help people to put it in a box to systematize it in kind of the landscape of the broader literature. But I think importantly, these main conclusions are only a tiny part of a research paper. And I think this is very important. So my claim would be that something like a knowledge norm of assertion would actually apply to most of what appears in a scientific publication, but for whatever reason, for a reason that I think Dang and Bright leave open, and which I will also leave open, this doesn't apply to main conclusions specifically. So the part where you, kind of the thing you put in your title to say what your paper's about or what the upshot is. But this would mean that the knowledge norm of assertion is applying to what we might call the meat of the paper, or the things that we might also think are most important in terms of what concretely other scientists are going to use and build on. So when scientists write a paper, depending on the kind of paper, they might be reporting observations, they might be reporting evidence of various types that they may have gathered. They will be making arguments and telling you what follows from what in various forms. So this could be kind of informal argumentation, or they could have proofs, or they could have, they could have demonstrated a model or built up a model, and then they're going to tell you a lot of things about the model. So look, it follows from my model that this is the case, that this is impossible, that this is likely, that these two things are related. If it's a model-based paper, they're going to be telling you what happens in their model. Maybe it's a simulation kind of model, and then they're going to say, look, these are the things that can arise from these input parameters. This is a possible consequence of the model. Again, this is not possible given the model. Within the paper, you'll be told what the open problems are in the literature. You'll be told in general, I think, a lot about the literature, kind of what things still need to be worked on, what things are known, what things are unknown. The scientists might say things about what possible implications of their findings, their arguments are. And I think it's important that most of these things, so quite plausibly, if you go through a paper, most of the things that are asserted in the course of the paper, I think are expected to be known by the scientists. And so I think if we imagine that some scientists may make a paper and maybe they sell the paper by having it in the title something like theory A is way better than theory B, and theory B should be abandoned or something like this. So it's an ugly title, but this could be the sense of the title. And maybe in the introduction, they write something similar. They say, look, we show that theory A is great. In the conclusion, they're going to reiterate this. I think this is what would fall under Dang and Bright's argument, where this possibly is not justified, possibly their evidence is not sufficient for making such a strong claim. Maybe the scientists don't even believe it and they just want to be a bit provocative. But I think still then if you would look at the meat of the paper and how the scientists are going about arguing that theory A is way better than theory B, again, they're going to be putting forth evidence, they're going to be putting forth a model, and I think the knowledge standard applies to the thing in there. And if it turns out, let's just imagine that 10 years down the road, we decide, okay, now it's pretty clear, actually, theory B was the better theory. I think the authors of that paper will not be in trouble for kind of proclaiming that theory A was better, but I think they would be in trouble if it turns out that they did not kind of meet the knowledge standard for the more concrete components of the paper. So if they report some evidence and it turns out that they didn't know that evidence, or they report what happens in their model and it turns out that they didn't actually know the things they claimed about that, I think they would be in a lot of trouble. So it turns out that they didn't check their code that carefully when they simulated something. I think that's really a problem because we expect the scientists to know, to really know when they say, okay, my model shows that X is impossible, they are held to a standard of knowledge about that. I think quite plausibly it's just then what general conclusions they draw from them for whatever reason is maybe not held at the same standard. Right. And so I think this is important because then it shows that, well, okay, there is a knowledge standard somewhere in science, and it's plausibly extremely important. It's just not universal, right? So there's kind of strangely and surprisingly, the title doesn't have to meet the same standard, but knowledge is still very important. Okay, so to attempt a similar reconciliation regarding Fabian Peter's argument. Although in this case, maybe it's less fair to call it a reconciliation because I argue against her claim. But anyhow, Peter argued to recall that a knowledge norm was too high of a standard for the inputs into a political deliberation process because, say, the experts that you're appealing to, the scientists, face themselves too much uncertainty to meet a knowledge standard. And regarding this argument, I would push back and argue that that basically it's just a misconception that acting on knowledge means that you don't have uncertainty. And I think this is a common misconception. It comes up very often in the discussion about the knowledge norm of action and the knowledge first literature. But I think it's very important actually that you can fulfill the knowledge norm of action while still being extremely uncertain. Because I think that acting on your knowledge doesn't mean that you ignore the complexity and kind of move from maybe a discovery that, well, there's a wide range of possibilities and things aren't so clear, to a super simplified proposition, which you put forward in the debate. But rather acting on your knowledge would mean basically properly articulating what you know and what you don't know. So properly articulating simultaneously your knowledge and your uncertainty, taking that seriously, and then putting that on the table as an input to political discourse. And so I think it's kind of intuitive to think, well, yeah, okay, say we're, again, just imagine we're trying to decide what to do about climate change. If you think that the inputs into your decision-making process have to be things like sea levels are going to rise by precisely this much in precisely this amount of time, or such and such country is going to be on fire tomorrow if we don't do something, then of course it looks like, okay, we can't know these things, and so we have to act on something which isn't knowledge. But if you have a kind of broader and more realistic conception of what the inputs can look like, and if the inputs are allowed to be a bit more realistic, a bit more complex, then you see that it's perfectly fine to have as an input something which looks more like the knowledge that we actually have. So, for example, if all we know actually is that sea levels might rise between X and Y meters in some certain period of time, then I would argue that, well, okay, this is an item of knowledge. This should be the input to our deliberation process, and then our action should be a function of this range, not of some kind of best guess that we make, which simplifies and kind of erases or ignores the uncertainty we have about how much sea levels might actually rise. This is very closely related to the argument that I made in the paper that Marius mentioned, where I argue basically that if we want a knowledge-based decision theory, we should be looking at decision theories which themselves accommodate more uncertainty than kind of very standard simplistic ones. So there are decision theories for situations of, say, ambiguity. This builds in more uncertainty into the decision-making process. And if you think that a decision theory could look like that, then it's very easy to see that, well, okay, the things we could input into such a theory can be knowledge, because knowledge doesn't have to be kind of, very simple and broad brush, but our knowledge can rather reflect what we know and what we don't know. So then finally, I would return to Mercier and Sperber's argumentative theory of reasoning. And here the issue was that knowledge basically just doesn't appear in the theory, even though we would expect it to. And here, I think what we need to do is just make the role of knowledge in the reasoning and argumentation process more visible. And I have multiple ideas about how this could be done. So the first idea is simply to claim that agents must know their reasons. So Mercier and Sperber they don't deny this. The way the rhetoric suggests, again, that when you give a reason, your standards are very lax. They make it sound in many cases like agents, when they're reasoning in a social context, can just kind of throw out a lot of bullshit. But I think it's actually compatible with everything they say, or with most of what they say, and with the examples that they're giving, that when agents engage in this reasoning process, the things they're putting forward, the reasons they're providing are actually known or should be known. And I think this is easy to see if we, again, I made up a dialogue, which is basically very typical for the kinds of sample dialogues they use to argue for their argumentative theory of reasoning. But I gave it kind of a knowledge first kind of twist just to help make the point. So we can easily imagine two housemates, and they are reasoning to determine what they're going to do on Saturday. And one of them kind of clearly wants to go to the movies, and the other kind of, let's say, seems to want to go on a picnic or something like this. And we can imagine the first agent saying, "Oh, come on, we haven't been to the movies in so long." And the second agent replies, "But the sun is also out, and the sun has not been out in like 6 months. which is basically true here, perhaps for you also. And then maybe the first agent says, yeah, okay, but the weather is going to stay like this for a while. It's going to be sunny also next weekend. And well, the film I want to see only runs through this weekend. And we can imagine then the second agent coming back and saying, hey, you don't know that it's not going to rain again next weekend. Have you even bothered to look at the forecast? So what does this sample dialogue show? Again, it's pretty typical for the kind of sample dialogue Mercier and Sperber give. And on the one hand, very clearly, the agents are putting forth reasons which fit their own purposes. So they both have a goal regarding where they would prefer to go over the weekend, and they're putting reasons on the table just according to how well they support their preferred course of action. But this doesn't mean that the things they're putting on the table don't count as knowledge. So the standard is low in a different way, kind of the significance or the relevance, which reasons we should pay attention to is what needs to be determined. But there can still be, and there does seem still to be, a knowledge standard for putting a reason on the table. And we can see this because, yeah, okay, both of the agents, well, they both know what the weather's like. They both know the last time they went to the movies. They maybe have the same access to the schedule of the movie theater. But if one of them puts a reason on the table, which we think, well, okay, they don't know that, they're just kind of making it up because they want to, the one wants to go to the movies instead of going to a picnic, then that can be challenged. And it can be challenged in exactly the predicted way, namely by saying, hey, you don't know that that's true. You're just saying it because it kind of fits your purposes. So there's another bit of discussion in the book, which I think also fits my purposes pretty well. And I think we have time for me to say something about this also. Because I also found this bit of their argument very interesting. So in their book, Mercier and Sperber, they report on some experiments which they want to use to argue for basically reasoning as they understand it being culturally universal. And so they discuss some experiments which were aiming originally to see whether something like logical reasoning ability was kind of innate or rather required some formal education. And so the experimenters asked unschooled peasants to draw some simple inferences. So they give them some sentences and they ask them, okay, what follows? And the inference that the subjects are supposed to be drawing is that the bears in the far north are white. And what the experimenters found were that the subjects, the ones who had never had any kind of school training, were basically unwilling to draw a very, very simple inference, namely that there are white bears in the north. And the question is why not? So Mercier and Sperber argue that it's not that the subjects couldn't reason logically, but rather that so it turns out that it seems that they didn't want to draw the inference because they weren't sure that it was true. And this is illustrated by some sample dialogue, from their book, from the experiments, where a young Uzbek is reported to have said, well, okay, from your words, it means that bears there are white. So they understand that kind of the premises they've been supplied imply that there are white bears, but still many of the subjects, or I think most of the subjects, don't want to draw the inference, even though they kind of understand that that's what's required. The kind of clear interpretation of what they say from my perspective is that they won't give this inference because they don't feel that they meet the standard of knowing that it's true that the bears are white in the north. So an older man says, for example, what the cock knows how to do, he does. What I know, I say, and nothing beyond that. And they quote another old man saying, well, I haven't seen any white bears, and so yeah, I can't say I would have had to have seen a white bear to tell you that there are white bears in the north. And this, to me, seems to be pretty clear evidence that the agents, they don't want to put forward a reason, they don't want to state something which they don't know. And for them, because they're not used to kind of logic problems, this means, well, you have to have seen the thing to claim that it exists. Okay, So that was the one, basically the first attempt at reconciliation between the knowledge-centric perspective and the argumentative theory, to claim that, well, okay, the reasons that you put forward have to be known, and it simply wasn't mentioned in the book, but there's no reason to think this isn't the case. There are good reasons to think that the reasons put forward need to meet the knowledge requirement. Second idea, so Mercier and Sperber claim that if people have convergent interests and mutual trust, then they don't need to argue with one another. And this, I think, is just not true. So their idea, I guess, is that when we're reasoning, it's because, yeah, I want to go on a picnic and you want to go in the movies, and so we need to reason to figure out where we're going to go. If we both have the same goal and we're not trying to mislead one another, then there's no need to do this. Yeah, but I think that this, it's simply not the case. So we can imagine that you can imagine we or some friends, they get together and maybe they have mutual trust that they're not trying to mislead one another, and maybe they have a common purpose. Say we want to figure out what to do about climate change or something like this. If we think about a kind of complicated case like that, then it's pretty clear that we have to reason, we have to provide arguments, even if we have a common goal and no one's trying to deceive anyone else, simply because it's not obvious what to do. So basically we have a lot of knowledge collectively, perhaps, but it's still a big question. It's a big challenge to try to transform this big mess of knowledge into a relevant conclusion or an action, right? Because this is kind of suggested by part one of my response to Mercier and Sperber. It's not a question of do you know something or not. It's a question of, okay, we know so many things. Which is the one which is really relevant to say what we're going to do on Saturday, right? So it's kind of the relevance of the items of knowledge is what's important. And it's work to put these items of knowledge together and to transform them into a course of action. Right, and if we have this kind of idea, it kind of changes it changes the picture of exactly what's going on a bit by acknowledging that the reasons have to be knowledge, but that it doesn't make the problem of reasoning easy. It doesn't make the problem of deciding what to do easy. And this is important for the third part of my response to the argument, which has to do with how we integrate the idea of there being reliable informants who are the people with useful knowledge. So if you say, well, okay, it's clear that we want to label some people as knowers, and this is very important, this is very useful for us. How exactly do we integrate this with a theory of reasoning where, well, okay, we decide what to do by putting reasons on the table and putting them all together? So you could think that if we as a community have kind of labeled some people as knowers, then it could just allow us to shortcut the reasoning process. But I think this is often going to be too optimistic. So we could imagine, again, that we have experts about things like climate science and sociology, and, well, okay, those are knowers for the purposes of deciding what to do about, say, climate change. But the fact that those people have useful knowledge doesn't allow us to shortcut all the reasoning process, because, again, we still need to find a way to put together all of the information that we have in the right way, in a kind of useful way, and translate that into a course of action. So reasoning is still required. Maybe it's helpful to know who actually knows something about the topic and who's just making things up, but reasoning is still necessary. And there's a very important caveat here, namely that so Mercier and Sperber point out that people who are very good at reasoning are very good at manipulating others and even themselves, because they are very, very good at kind of selectively pulling premises to fit a story that they're motivated to tell, or to support a course of action that they support. And the same thing is going to apply to experts, because they have according to kind of my version of their story, they have just a bigger pool of knowledge to draw on. And that means that then when they're kind of systematically putting forth reasons to fit a story that they want to tell or an action that they want to take, they have just so much more to draw on that they're at a huge advantage in trying to make sure the argumentation goes in the direction they want it to take. So this means that, well, on the one hand, it's always important to kind of know who the knowers are, who the reliable informants are. On the one hand, this can be good if we simply want to take the information from them, but it can also be dangerous, and we want to be aware that they have an argumentative advantage, and it may be difficult, but nonetheless still very important to engage in a kind of argumentation with them. And not just say just to do whatever they think we would like to do. So maybe to translate this again to a climate context, it could be that many of us think that it would be great if the climate scientists just decided on the course of action for all of us, but it's also the case that they are simply at an argumentative advantage by virtue of knowing so much, and it may still be very important in terms of deciding what to do to get input from people who know much less, but nonetheless maybe have interests which still need to be taken into account or well represented, well accounted for. Okay, so yeah, I think this was quite a lot, so sorry about that, but I'll try to bring things together through a couple of conclusions. The first conclusion is that, okay, in these three accounts that I showed you, Liam's account about science, Peter's account about political deliberation, and the argumentative theory of reasoning, knowledge doesn't play a kind of glamorous role in any of these accounts, but I think that's maybe partially because that wasn't kind of the thing which was new and interesting and special about what the people wanted to argue for. Knowledge looks a bit kind of old-fashioned, traditional, but I think each of these arguments is going to have major problems and not reflect reality very well if there isn't a lot of knowledge in the background. So knowledge is, I argued, extremely important as a standard for most of what scientists are communicating with one another. I think we're in an extremely poor position to make political decisions if we don't make the best possible use of what scientists really know, including kind of honestly saying what we are still uncertain about. And arguably, reasoning and argumentation only functions because we are drawing on things that we do know and not just properly putting nonsense on the table, because that's not going to help us to make a decision. This kind of shows furthermore that all three of these stories, well, they tell us about one part of the picture, but they also leave a lot of open questions, and we need to fill in the details to more thoroughly understand what's going on in all of these settings. And it seems to me that part of filling in the details means integrating the knowledge perspective and integrating the fact that, well, there are knowers and non-knowers, there's our knowledge might have a sort of structure and so forth. My third conclusion, maybe the meatier conclusion, is that action is somehow very special, and knowledge-based decisions look maybe different from how we would have thought. So I think it's the case that basically assertions and also your beliefs, I think they really don't matter, except insofar as they somehow translate into outcomes in the typical case. So maybe it doesn't matter what you say, it doesn't matter what you think, but eventually you're going to do something, and it's very important whether you do one thing or another in terms of your well-being and everyone else's well-being. And therefore, I think it's important and well-motivated that when we act, we have a solid knowledge base for our actions. As I mentioned before, there's a kind of a common impulse reply to this idea that, well, okay, we can't require people to act only on what they know because it's just too high a barrier. We're beset with uncertainty. And I want to argue that kind of the opposite of this intuition is the case, and that acting on knowledge is actually a very low barrier for various reasons. So one is that our knowledge, we know less than we believe, or less than we kind of conjecture or guess. And when we frame our knowledge, again, it incorporates a lot of uncertainty. If we're thinking about a kind of reasoning context, okay, how are we going to act? Well, we have tons and tons of knowledge available. So making an action that we can somehow trace back to things that we know, that's pretty easy, right? Because we kind of saw already, people are very good at putting items of knowledge on the table that support things that they want to do. What's very difficult, perhaps, is still making a good choice, because very clearly, well, when you're facing a lot of uncertainty, and it's simply a difficult problem where you have to take into account divergent interests by many people, many different people in a society, and it's quite unclear what the future is going to hold. It's very difficult to decide what to do, even once you put all your knowledge on the table. Similarly, you have a lot of known propositions on the table. It's difficult to say, okay, which are the relevant ones? Which are the ones that we should really pay attention to when we decide what to do tomorrow or something like that. And what seems then sensible to me is that argumentation or reasoning, as Mercier and Sperber describe it, is actually a good procedure for making knowledge-based choices. So this isn't something I focused on or maybe even mentioned, but it's taken to be a big open problem. Okay, if knowledge is the norm of action, if you should act only on what you know, what does a knowledge-based decision theory look like? It's generally considered that we don't have such a theory. I think it's quite plausible that, well, how is it that you make decisions based on your knowledge? Well, maybe it's via a process as opposed to a kind of abstract theory about the shape of your utility function or something like this. So how do we make knowledge-based choices? Well, by reasoning with others, right? Because we have a huge knowledge base, we take turns kind of putting items of knowledge on the table, kind of suggesting that this is something very important that we should pay attention to. And arguably, kind of when we undergo a procedure like that, where everyone has had the opportunity to put the things that seem most important to them on the table, when we integrate all of this, then out comes ideally decision, and we could call this a knowledge-based decision. Yeah, so I think it's already been pretty long, so I will leave it at that, and I look forward to hearing your questions.